What if an ancient family curse wasn't just a legend, but something stalking the moors at night? A wealthy nobleman is dead. A gigantic black hound has been seen in the darkness, and the last heir to the Baskerville family may be next. When Dr. Mortimer brings the strange case to Sherlock Holmes, it seems to be a tale of ghosts and superstition. But Holmes knows that behind every impossible mystery lies a hidden truth, if someone is clever enough to uncover it. Tonight, you'll experience The Hound of the Baskervilles, one of the greatest detective novels ever written by Arthur Conan Doyle, carefully condensed and rewritten into modern English while preserving the original story, characters, and atmosphere. So settle in and step onto the lonely moors of Dartmoor, where every shadow hides a secret, and every distant howl may bring you closer to the truth. The Hound of the Baskervilles, a modern adaptation. Chapter 1. The Stick, the Curse, and the Client. Sherlock Holmes was, as a rule, a late riser, given the irregular hours he kept. Nights spent pacing our sitting room over some knotty problem, then vanishing into the London fog on errands he rarely explained until they were finished. But on this particular morning, a raw one in early autumn, with the fog pressing thick and yellow against our windows, I found him already up and dressed, standing at the breakfast table with a walking stick in his hands, turning it over, as though it were a puzzle rather than a piece of furniture. He'd clearly been at it a while before I came down. The fire was well built up, and a pot of coffee sat cooling, forgotten, at his elbow. I had spent the previous evening with him in comfortable silence, each of us buried in our own reading, so his intense focus on the stick surprised me. It was a fine, thick piece of wood with a bulbous head, the kind of thing a country doctor might carry. Solid, well used, respectable, the sort of stick a man leans on crossing wet fields rather than city pavement. A silver band was fitted just below the head, engraved with a date, 1884, and inscribed to someone. It had clearly been left behind by a visitor the night before, after we'd both gone to bed, and neither of us had thought to give it back. "Well, Watson," Holmes said without looking up, "what do you make of it?" I turned the stick over in my hands, feeling somewhat foolish. I should say it belongs to an older man, successful in his practice. The wood is quality, and the silver band isn't cheap. The inscription suggests his colleagues thought well enough of him to present him with a gift on his departure from somewhere. A country practice, going by the wear on the wood. A city doctor doesn't walk far enough to wear a stick down like this. Holmes smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that always made me feel like a schoolboy who'd gotten half the answer right. Not bad at all, though you've reasoned backward from the wrong end and landed on the right answer largely by accident. The inscription reads, "To James Mortimer from his friends at the CCH, with the year 1884. CCH, the Charing Cross Hospital. It's the sort of leaving present, given to a doctor when he moves on from a hospital post to start a private country practice. That, and the year, puts our man at around 5 years out of hospital work. He is a country practitioner then, and not a fashionable one. A fashionable doctor keeps a carriage, not a walking stick. Now, look here." He held the stick up to the light and pointed to a series of small dents near the base. "A man who spends his days in town wears down his stick evenly, in a smooth curve. But this pattern, these deep, closed scuffs, all clustered together, that's the mark of a dog's teeth. A large dog, from the spread of the bite. One who habitually carries the stick for its master, or gnaws at it while waiting outside a door. And the wear is fresh, made by a young and vigorous jaw, I should say a curly-haired spaniel, somewhat larger than the usual sort." "Remarkable," I said, and meant it. The bell rang, and a moment later our landlady showed in our visitor. He was a tall, thin man of about 30, with a long nose and a habit of pushing his spectacles up onto his forehead, then losing them again a moment later, as though he could never quite settle on where they belonged. He had the slightly stooped, half-apologetic bearing of a scholar rather than a man of action, which, as it turned out, was close to the truth. His clothes were good, but carelessly worn. Behind him trotted a curly-haired spaniel, exactly as young and lively as Holmes had predicted, sniffing eagerly at the corners of our sitting room. "I'm so sorry," the man said, spotting the walking stick immediately and crossing to retrieve it with evident relief. I wasn't sure whether I'd left it here or at the shipping office. I would be very sorry indeed to lose it." "A gift, I think," said Holmes. "Yes, from my colleagues at Charing Cross on my marriage." He seemed pleasantly startled that Holmes knew this, though of course Holmes had only guessed at the marriage from the wording of the inscription. "I'm James Mortimer," he went on, settling into the chair Holmes offered and studying my friend with unconcealed fascination. "And it's a great honor to meet you, Mr. Holmes. I recognized the shape of your skull the moment I saw you last night. A really excellent supraorbital development. Would you mind? Terribly if I ran my fingers along your parietal fissure sometime, purely for scientific interest. A cast of your skull would be a genuine ornament to any anthropological museum." Holmes waved him toward a chair, looking mildly entertained rather than offended. "You're an enthusiast in your own line, I perceive, just as I am in mine," he said, nodding at Mortimer's stained forefinger. "That tells me you roll your own cigarettes. Don't hesitate to light up." Mortimer produced tobacco and rolled a cigarette with surprising dexterity. Then his manner changed entirely. The easy, scholarly chatter fell away, and something more urgent crept into his voice. "Mr. Holmes, I've come to you not only because I'm an admirer of your methods, but because I am, at this moment, faced with a most serious and extraordinary problem, and I recognize that I am the wrong sort of man to solve it. I am a man of science, and I don't know how to evaluate a matter that sits right on the edge of what science can explain." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed manuscript, its edges soft with handling. "This document was given into my keeping by my friend and patient, the late Sir Charles Baskerville, whose sudden death some 3 months ago created a considerable stir in Devonshire. I may say I was his personal friend as well as his medical attendant. He was a strong-minded man, shrewd, practical, and about as far from being fanciful as I am myself. Yet he took this document very seriously indeed, and I confess his death has prepared me for the sort of event which it foretells." He unfolded the paper and began to read aloud, the handwriting old-fashioned, dated to 1742, composed by a Baskerville for the benefit of his sons, a warning, not a boast. The document told the story of the family and a curse laid upon them going back over 200 years, to the days of the Civil War. One Hugo Baskerville, wild, profane, and godless, the manuscript called him, an ancestor of wicked reputation, had conceived a passion for the daughter of a local yeoman farmer. When she refused him, he and a handful of lawless friends seized her while the men of her household were away and carried her back to Baskerville Hall, where he locked her in an upper room while he caroused below. The girl found the old ivy on the outer wall thick enough to serve as a rough ladder, and climbed down into the darkness, fleeing across the moor toward her father's home some 3 leagues distant, running through country she barely knew in the black of a moonless night. Hugo, discovering his prisoner gone, flew into a rage that frightened even his drunken companions, and declared before them all that he would give his body and soul to the powers of evil that very night, if he might only overtake her. He called for his horse and hounds, and rode out after her onto the moor. His friends, sobered by his fury, followed some time later and found his hunting dogs whimpering at the mouth of a hollow, refusing to go further no matter how they were struck. 3 of the boldest riders pressed on regardless. What they found there, by moonlight, chilled them to their bones. The girl lay dead of exhaustion and fright before ever a hand was laid on her. Beside her lay Hugo, also dead, and standing over the 2 bodies worrying at his throat was a great black beast, shaped like a hound but larger than any hound that mortal eyes had ever beheld, its eyes and muzzle glowing as though lit from within by some hellish fire of its own. The document warned every future Baskerville to avoid crossing the moor in the dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted, for the hound had returned, it was believed, again and again down through the generations, and many Baskervilles had died sudden violent deaths near that same lonely stretch of country. "You'll understand why someone showed you this," Holmes said when Mortimer had finished, "but I don't yet see why you bring it to me. I collect fairy tales as a hobby, Dr. Mortimer, but I don't typically investigate them." "I haven't gotten to the interesting part yet," Mortimer said gravely. He pulled out a copy of the Devon County Chronicle and read the account of Sir Charles's death. Sir Charles, a widower of about 60, wealthy through fortunate investments in South Africa, and generous to local causes, had been in the habit of taking a nightly walk along a stretch of the grounds known as the Yew Alley, a long walk enclosed by ancient yew hedges, running from the house down to a gate onto the moor. On the night in question he had gone out as usual, smoking a cigar, and never returned. His body was found the next morning near that gate, lying face down, his hands outstretched. There was no wound, but his face was distorted almost beyond recognition, so much so that the doctor first called refused at first to believe it was truly Sir Charles at all. This was put down to a sudden heart attack, entirely consistent with a heart condition Mortimer himself had been treating him for. His footprints could be traced clearly down the gravel, and at some point toward the end of that walk, the character of those prints seemed to change, as if he had begun walking on his toes, hurrying or running. "That's the official account," Mortimer said, setting the paper down. "Now let me tell you the facts as I know them personally, since I was among the first on the scene. Sir Charles's nerves had been badly strained in the weeks before his death, far more than the newspaper admits. He had come to believe quite genuinely in the family curse, and although he walked his usual path each evening, wild horses could not have persuaded him onto the open moor after dark. He kept a revolver in his pocket on those walks, and asked me more than once whether I believed such a creature as the Hound could exist outside an old family scandal sheet. I always answered honestly that I had not seen one, though I'll admit a farmer near Grimpen has more than once sworn to me he's heard just such a cry across the darkness. On the night he died, Barrymore, who found the body, sent for me at once, and I was at the hall within the hour before anyone else had disturbed the ground. I examined the footprints myself, kneeling with a lantern. Sir Charles's own tracks were clear on both sides of the alley for its full length, steady walking going out, and then, near the last 20 yards before the gate, shorter, deeper prints as if he'd broken into a run. And then, Mortimer paused, and I saw his hand tremble. And then, close by the gate itself, on the soft earth just past where the gravel gives way to turf, I found another set of tracks entirely. "A man's?" Holmes asked sharply. "Mr. Holmes," said Dr. Mortimer, his voice dropping low, "they were the footprints of an enormous hound." There was silence in the room. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright with a particular intensity I had learned to recognize as the first spark of genuine interest. "You told no one? What good would it do? The people of the area already believe in the demon beast of the Baskervilles. I had no wish to add fuel to that fire, and no proof beyond a footprint that could easily be scoffed away as some farmer's dog. Even I struggle to fully credit it in the light of day, Mr. Holmes, and I am a man who prides himself on scientific detachment. But at night, alone, thinking of poor Sir Charles's twisted, terrified face, I find my rational convictions rather harder to hold on to." Sir Charles's nearest heir, Mortimer explained, was a nephew, Henry Baskerville, currently living in Canada or the United States. The family had lost close touch with that branch. A telegram had already been sent, and Sir Henry was due to arrive in London that very day, having just crossed the Atlantic. This, it turned out, was the true purpose of Mortimer's visit. "Your concern," Holmes said slowly, "is that this young man, arriving to claim an inheritance surrounded by a legend of doom, and by an unexplained death featuring the tracks of a gigantic hound, may be walking into genuine danger." "Precisely, Mr. Holmes. I don't know whether to advise him to come to the hall at all. If I tell him the truth, he may refuse to come, and the estate will lose its master. If I say nothing and something happens to him, I will never forgive myself." Holmes sat in silence a long moment, fingertips pressed together. "Come back tomorrow at 10. Bring Sir Henry Baskerville with you, if he's willing." Then, as Mortimer rose to go, "One more question. You say Sir Charles was alone when he went out that night. Had he told anyone he intended to keep an appointment at that gate?" His butler mentioned that a letter had come for him that morning, from a London postmark, which seemed to trouble him a good deal. He read it at breakfast and grew pale. It was found burned in the study grate afterward, mostly destroyed. Barrymore glimpsed only a single line before it crumbled to ash. "And that line?" It said something like, "For God's sake, be at the gate by 10 o'clock." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Thank you, Dr. Mortimer. This is beginning to look like a case worth my attention after all. I will see you and Sir Henry tomorrow at 10 sharp." When our visitor had gone, spaniel trotting at his heels, Holmes rose and crossed to the window, watching the London traffic below, his hands clasped behind his back. A curse 200 years old does not usually wait until the weak a rich man dies to reach out and take him, Watson. Not unless someone living has a very pressing reason to make sure it does. Someone sent Sir Charles a letter that frightened him into standing alone at a gate on the edge of the moor after dark. Someone, or something, was waiting for him there. There is a hound in this, real or imagined, and either way I don't like sending a young man, ignorant of the danger, out to walk in his uncle's footsteps until we understand a good deal more than we do now. Chapter 2. The Heir from America. Holmes was up long before me the next morning, deep in a stack of large-scale survey maps of Devonshire. I have been to Devonshire, Watson, without leaving this room. He gestured at the maps spread across the table. Here is Baskerville Hall, here is Merripit House, where the naturalist Stapleton lives, here is Grimpen Village, and here, he tapped a wide, irregular blank patch, is Grimpen Mire, a great treacherous swamp that has swallowed ponies and cattle and, I don't doubt, the occasional careless man, without leaving so much as a bootlace behind. It's a fitting home, I don't doubt, for whatever manner of hound haunts that part of the world. He had scarcely finished speaking when the bell rang, and a few minutes later Mortimer was shown up, followed by a new figure. A small, alert, dark-eyed man of about 30, sturdily built, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life outdoors in a rougher climate than England's. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I believe," the young man said, shaking Holmes's hand with a firm, direct grip. "I'm Henry Baskerville. It's a queer business Mortimer's dragged you into, and queerer still that I should have to come to a detective on my first morning back in England, though I don't suppose I'd have believed half of it if I hadn't had a taste of the queerness myself, not an hour past breakfast." "You've had an experience already?" Holmes said, eyebrows rising. "Nothing so terrible as being chased by anything with big teeth, Mr. Holmes, if that's your meaning." Sir Henry produced an envelope. "But this came for me at the hotel this morning. Someone knew exactly where I was staying before I'd been in the country a full day." Inside was a single sheet, the message assembled word by word from letters cut from a printed page. "As you value your life or your reason, keep away from the moor." Only the word moor had been written by hand. Holmes examined it through his pocket lens. "The words are cut from yesterday's Times, from a leading article on free trade. The typeface matches precisely. Whoever prepared this did so in a hurry, with a small pair of nail scissors. The address was written in a disguised hand, printed, rather than in cursive, but printed in a manner that betrays an educated writer trying to look uneducated, which is nearly always more revealing than the reverse. This was posted yesterday evening from the district around Charing Cross." He set the letter down. "What strikes me most is the word moor itself, written by hand rather than pasted like the rest. It tells me the writer searched that morning's paper and simply could not find the word printed anywhere convenient, and rather than delay the letter, wrote it in, and risked the one scrap of handwriting that might identify him. Which tells me, Sir Henry, that whoever sent this believed it urgent you receive it before. You left London, meaning they know your movements rather better than a stranger ought to." "Has anything else out of the ordinary happened?" Holmes asked, however trivial it might seem. Sir Henry hesitated, then gave a short, embarrassed laugh. "It's a small thing, and I feel a fool mentioning it in the same breath as poison pen letters, but yes, I lost a boot last night. One boot out of a new pair put outside my door to be polished. Only one came back this morning, and there was a fellow with a black beard watching my luggage rather too closely at the customs house yesterday. I put it down to nothing more than idle curiosity at the time. A new arrival gets stared at especially. One who still dresses more like a cattleman than an English gentleman, as my tailor keeps reminding me." "Tell me about your voyage," Holmes said. "Was there anyone aboard the ship who paid you more attention than a stranger ordinarily would?" Sir Henry considered this seriously. "Nothing I noticed, though I wasn't looking. That fellow at customs is the only one who comes to mind." "And this fellow, did you see where he went afterward or take note of his cab?" "I can't say I did. I had my hands full with trunks at the time." "No matter, we shall keep it in mind." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. A stolen shoe, on its own, might be a chambermaid's carelessness. Taken together with the letter, it suggested that someone with a very particular interest in Sir Henry Baskerville was already at work in London before he'd so much as glimpsed the moor that was said to threaten him. Mortimer now told us the fuller family history. The fortune built on South African investment, the strict entail meaning it must pass to a Baskerville male and no other, and Sir Henry as the sole heir. Since the middle of three brothers, Roger, a wild, reckless man said to resemble the wicked Hugo of the old legend, had fled to Central America after some scandal and died there, apparently without issue. And the entail itself, Holmes pressed, how strictly is it drawn? Could the estate pass to some distant branch, should misfortune befall Sir Henry before he marries and produces an heir of his own? Strictly indeed, Mortimer said. The property must pass generation after generation to the nearest male Baskerville, and cannot be sold or willed away outside the direct line. Should misfortune befall Sir Henry, unmarried and without issue, I confess I do not know precisely who would inherit next. The solicitors would have to trace the family tree a good deal further than I'm equipped to do from memory. That, said Holmes with quiet emphasis, is a detail I should like clarified before Sir Henry sets foot on that moor. An estate of this size, entailed so strictly, has a way of narrowing a list of suspects, rather more usefully than any amount of speculation about ghostly hounds. Holmes questioned Sir Henry closely about his own history, his ranch upbringing in the American West, his complete unfamiliarity with England and with the uncle he'd never met, who had settled a small allowance on his branch of the family but had otherwise been a stranger to him, and found nothing to suggest Sir Henry himself knew anything of the danger awaiting him. He was, in short, exactly what he appeared, a straightforward, good-humoured young man, entirely unprepared for what his inheritance was dragging him into, and inclined to treat the whole business, at least on the surface, as an adventure rather than a threat. "I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Holmes," Sir Henry said at one point, "I've herded cattle through worse than an English fog, and I don't scare easy. But I'll admit that letter gave me a turn I didn't much care for." "Well, Sir Henry," Holmes said at last, "the question is simple to state and difficult to answer. Do you intend to go to Baskerville Hall?" "Of course I do," Sir Henry said at once, with a flash of temper that told me a good deal about his character. "I don't see why I should turn tail because someone sends me a letter made of newspaper clippings or steals a boot from outside my door. If the devil himself is loose on that moor, I mean to go and have a look at him. It's my family's land, Mr. Holmes, and I don't intend to run from it." "That," said Holmes with something like approval, "is exactly the answer I hoped for, but I would ask that you not go alone. Watson here is a man of steady nerve and considerable resource, and, if you're willing to have him, I should feel a good deal easier knowing he was at your side. My own presence in London is still required a while longer, for reasons that will soon become clear." Sir Henry agreed readily, seeming glad of the company, and it was arranged that he, Mortimer, and I would travel down within the week. Holmes promised to join us as soon as his London inquiries permitted. As our visitors rose to leave, Sir Henry paused at the door. "There's one more thing, now I think of it. When I dressed today, I found my old black boots, the ones I've worn every day since the ship. One of those has gone missing as well. Not the new pair, the old ones." Holmes went very still. "You're quite certain? An old boot this time, not the new one that vanished last night?" "Quite certain. I'd swear to it." "This is a development of the very first importance, Sir Henry, though I shan't trouble you with my reasoning just yet. Guard your remaining boots carefully, and guard yourself a good deal more carefully still once you set foot on that moor." After they had gone, I asked Holmes directly what he made of the missing boots. "Think it through, Watson. First, a new boot disappears, unworn, still smelling of the shop rather than of Sir Henry himself. Then, the very next night, an old, well-worn boot goes missing in its place, while the first is presumably still sitting wherever it was taken. Why would a thief exchange a new boot for an old one, unless the new boot proved useless for whatever purpose he required it, and only the old one, carrying as it would the strong and particular scent of its owner, would serve his true purpose? I felt a chill settle over me. "A scent trail, for a dog to follow." "For a dog to follow," Holmes agreed grimly. Whether that dog turns out to be flesh and blood or something got up to resemble the family legend, I cannot yet say, but someone, Watson, is laying the groundwork for Sir Henry Baskerville to be hunted, quite literally, across that moor. And they are. Doing it with a patience I find considerably more alarming than any ghost story. Chapter 3. The Man in the Cab. Sir Henry and Mortimer had arranged to meet at our rooms again that afternoon, since Sir Henry wished to see something of the shops, and Holmes proposed in an offhand way I had learned never to take at face value that we accompany them part way. We had gone perhaps half a mile down Regent Street, Sir Henry admiring shop windows with the delight of a man newly arrived from a very different country, when Holmes stopped abruptly, his hand closing on my arm. "Don't look round, Watson, but tell me quietly." A hansom cab on the far side of the street, standing rather than moving, with a man inside. I glanced ahead using a shop window's reflection and made out a cab drawn up at the curb. A single passenger inside, half obscured by the hood, a heavy black beard and a pair of watchful eyes turned steadily in our direction. "That is our friend from the customs house," Holmes murmured. "And he's been behind us since Baker Street, stopping exactly when we stop. I mean to have a closer look at him." He detached himself from our group, with the casual air of a man who'd simply thought of an errand, crossing the street at an angle calculated to bring him alongside the cab without appearing to hurry. A crossing sweeper nearby, who witnessed the whole undignified spectacle of a well-dressed gentleman sprinting through traffic after a cab, was grinning broadly by the time Holmes rejoined us, and Holmes tossed the man a coin with poor grace, muttering something under his breath I did not entirely catch and was rather glad not to. But the man was watchful as well as patient. The moment Holmes's intention became clear, the bearded stranger rapped sharply on the roof, and the cab lurched forward into traffic, sending a fruit seller's barrow rocking dangerously in its wake. Holmes broke into a run, dodging between carriages, but a cab in open traffic will always beat a man on foot, and within 100 yards it had vanished around a corner. Holmes returned a few minutes later, breathing hard, his hat askew. "Well, Watson, there goes our first real chance to learn something useful, and I have made rather a public spectacle of myself chasing it. I did manage one thing. I noted the cab's number, 2704. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes dispatched Cartwright, a bright, willing street boy of about 14 he employed from time to time, with 2 tasks. The first was to track down cab number 2704 and learn everything the driver could tell him. The second was to make the rounds of every hotel near Charing Cross, examine the wastepaper baskets, and report back if he found a copy of that morning's Times with its leading article cut to pieces. A man does not carry scissors and a gum pot about with him on the chance he'll need to compose a threatening letter, Watson, Holmes explained. He does the cutting somewhere convenient and disposes of the ruined paper close at hand, most likely his own hotel room. If we're fortunate, Cartwright will find our mutilated newspaper in some hotel's dustbin and the register. For that day will give us a name, false perhaps, but a starting point. Cartwright returned some hours later, footsore but triumphant, having visited 23 hotels before his luck turned at the Northumberland Hotel. The wastepaper basket in room 24 had yielded the mangled remains of that morning's Times, its leading article cut through in a dozen places, matching the letter word for word. "The manager wouldn't say much at first, sir," Cartwright reported clearly, enjoying the telling of his own adventure, being a close sort of man about his guests. "But I told him I'd been sent by Mr. Sherlock Holmes on a matter touching a serious crime," which loosened his tongue considerably. The room had been let 2 days before to a gentleman travelling alone who paid a full week in advance and gave the name of Johnson. Big black beard, dark clothes, kept mostly to himself, took his meals in his room. Nervous, always glancing up sharp if the chambermaid entered without knocking. "Nervous," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "That is worth noting, Watson. A man engaged in nothing more than idle mischief does not generally glance up sharply at every chambermaid who enters his room. This is a man who believes himself, in some sense, engaged in serious and even dangerous business." The matter of the cab proved equally productive. Cartwright had traced number 2704 without difficulty, and the driver, a stout, cheerful man named John Clayton, was brought round to Baker Street and questioned directly. He'd been approached near Trafalgar Square promised a sovereign for silence, and told to follow the hansom outside the Northumberland Hotel all morning without getting too close. When they reached Regent Street and Holmes made his move, the fare had rapped on the roof and told him to drive like the devil, and, bold as brass, before they'd even started following anyone, had given his name straight off as Mr. Sherlock Holmes, should anyone ask. Holmes threw back his head and laughed, though there was little humour in it. "Well, Watson, our friend has a sense of theatre, and knows exactly who is troubling him, which tells us something useful in itself. This is no random mischief-maker, but a man who has taken the trouble to learn my name and reputation, and is confident enough to mock me for it to my own hired driver." Clayton could add little more beyond the beard and the fair's age, about 40, of middle height, save one detail. When the man first got down from the cab near Regent's Park, he'd glanced back sharply, as though checking he hadn't been seen. "That carefulness is worth noting," Holmes said, once Clayton had gone. "A man engaged in nothing more than idle mischief doesn't glance back to see who's watched him. This is a man who believes himself engaged in serious business and understands the risk of it." The following day brought one further development. Holmes had sent a telegram to Barrymore at the Hall, asking simply whether all was in readiness, and requesting confirmation it had been delivered into Barrymore's own hands. The reply came back oddly inconclusive. Barrymore himself answered, confirming all was ready, but the delivery boy's own separate wire reported he hadn't actually seen Barrymore in person, having left it instead with Mrs. Barrymore, since her husband was said to be up in the loft and couldn't conveniently come down. "Which means," Holmes said, turning the two telegrams over in his hands, "we have Barrymore's word alone that he was at the Hall that day, and no independent confirmation whatsoever. He might have been in the loft exactly as reported, or he might, at that very hour, have been standing on a London pavement, with a false black beard, watching Sir Henry examine a hat shop window." "You suspect Barrymore himself?" "I suspect everyone and no one in equal measure at this stage, Watson, which is precisely the discipline a case like this demands. He's served the family long and, by every account, faithfully. He also stands to inherit a comfortable legacy under Sir Charles's will, and he was the last person to see Sir Charles alive, and the first to find him dead. None of that makes him guilty of anything beyond an inconvenient number of coincidences attached to his name, but I intend to have him watched closely once you and Sir Henry are settled at the Hall, and I'd ask that you observe him yourself with particular care." Sir Henry called that evening to finalize the journey, in considerably improved spirits after a day spent being fitted for a wardrobe he described as respectable enough to bury a man in, which I suppose is fitting under the circumstances. He had also purchased a stout new pair of boots to replace the stolen ones, and joked that he intended to sleep with them under his pillow from now on. Before he left, Holmes extracted his promise never, under any circumstances, to walk the moor alone after dark, whatever the temptation or however foolish the precaution might seem in the moment. "One thing more, Sir Henry," Holmes added, his tone shifting to something more serious. "If you must go out at night, let Watson go with you and go armed. Will you give me your word on this?" Sir Henry hesitated only a moment before nodding, his earlier bravado tempered for once by the evident gravity in Holmes's voice. "You have my word, Mr. Holmes. I've no wish to test that old legend of ours more closely than I have to." When they had gone, Holmes stood a long while at the window, watching the gas lamps flicker to life along Baker Street. "There is a great deal I still don't understand about this business, Watson," he said at last. "And a great deal more, I suspect, I understand only in outline. But I do not like sending you and Sir Henry down into that country without me, and I would not do it at all if I did not believe my own presence here, for the next several days would prove more useful to his safety in the end. Watch him closely, watch the moor closer still, and Watson, if anything at all strikes you as wrong, however small, wire me at once. I would rather be roused by a false alarm a dozen times over than arrive one day too late to a true one." Chapter 4. Baskerville Hall. Saturday morning found the three of us, Sir Henry, Mortimer, and myself, assembled on the platform at Paddington, our luggage piled about us. Holmes came to see us off, though he said little of substance beyond a final word to me as the guard called for passengers to board. Keep your revolver with you at all times, Watson, day and night, and do not let Sir Henry go anywhere alone, whatever excuse he offers you. I shall write to you daily, and I trust you to do. The same for me, however uneventful the day may seem. The most useful facts in a case of this kind are very often the ones that seem, at the time, entirely too small to bother reporting. I promised him faithfully that I would, and within a few minutes the train had drawn out from beneath the great glass roof of the station, gathering speed as the city gave way by slow degrees to open country. Sir Henry grew more animated with every mile, pressing his face to the window like a boy on his first excursion, remarking on the low red brick farmhouses and hedgerows, so different from the wide flat country he'd known ranching in America. Mortimer, sitting across from us with his spaniel curled at his feet, supplied small facts about the passing countryside with the mild pleasure of a man well pleased to share his native county. It was not until early afternoon, as the train climbed into hillier country, that the landscape's character changed in a way I found considerably less charming than Sir Henry did. The neat fields gave way to granite outcrops, stunted trees bent permanently sideways by the wind, and at last the first long swells of open moorland, purple with heather, rising here and there into rocky tors that stood black against the grey sky like broken teeth. Here and there, a solitary farmhouse crouched low against the wind, smoke rising from a single chimney, the only sign of human life in an otherwise empty and indifferent expanse of country. There was a quality to the light itself I had not encountered in the softer countryside nearer London, a hard, flat clarity that seemed to strip the landscape of any comfortable illusion, leaving only bare stone and heather and the wind moving endlessly across it. "There," said Mortimer, "is your first proper sight of the moor, Dr. Watson. It grows on a man in time, though I'll grant it looks its worst on a grey afternoon such as this." Sir Henry had fallen silent, studying the bleak country with a wary, searching curiosity. "It's a fine, wild sort of country, all the same," he said at last, half to himself. "A man could lose himself out there and never be found again, I shouldn't wonder." We were met at the small station by a dog-cart and a wiry groom named Perkins, who touched his cap and set about loading our trunks, casting curious glances at his new master. As we set off along a narrow road, I noticed armed soldiers standing watch at a crossroads, and asked Perkins the reason. "There's a convict got loose from Princetown prison, sir, some 3 days back," Perkins said, flicking the reins. "Selden, his name is the Notting Hill murderer, a wicked, dangerous sort of man, killed a fellow in the most brutal way and showed no remorse for it at his trial. They've had soldiers and warders out combing the moor for him ever since, but he's given them the slip so far, and I dare say he'll go on doing it a good while longer, for there's 100 places out there a man could hide till doomsday if he knew the ground and didn't mind the wet and cold. The farmers hereabouts have taken to locking their doors of a night, which I don't recall them ever troubling to do before." "A pleasant welcome to the neighbourhood," Sir Henry said, though his tone suggested he found the news considerably less pleasant than his words let on. Mortimer remarked quietly that this was, in its own grim way, a fitting piece of news to greet Sir Henry's homecoming. A reminder that the moor held dangers enough of the ordinary human sort without any need to invoke a family curse. "Though I'll admit, the local folk have already begun murmuring that the convict and the old legend are somehow bound up together," he added with a faint, uneasy smile. "I don't credit it myself, but you'll hear the theory repeated in the village before the week is out." The road climbed steadily, the trees thinning and finally disappearing, until we drove across open moor in the fading light, the wind carrying a cold, damp smell of peat and heather. At last, as the light began properly to fail, we came over a rise, and Perkins pointed with his whip. "And there, sir, is Baskerville Hall." Sir Henry rose half out of his seat. The house stood at the heart of its own dark plantation of trees, a long grey stone building of considerable age, with twin towers rising at either end, and a great central hall between them from which a scattering of tall windows caught what little remained of the daylight. The avenue leading to it ran beneath a dense canopy of old twisted trees that met overhead in a kind of natural tunnel, shutting out what light remained so thoroughly that we drove the last stretch almost in darkness. "Is it always this dark along here?" Sir Henry asked, his voice carrying a studied casualness that didn't quite convince me. "This is the yew alley, Sir Henry," Mortimer said quietly, It was here that your uncle met his end. Sir Henry said nothing further, but I saw him glance sharply from side to side into the gloom. We emerged at last into the gravel sweep before the house, where a manservant waited at the great iron-studded door with a lamp raised. This was Barrymore, tall, black-bearded, composed, with a watchful quality to his dark eyes I couldn't immediately place. "Welcome home, Sir Henry," he said, bowing slightly. "My wife and I are very glad to see you. I should tell you we had intended, in light of recent events, to give notice and leave your service. The house has felt heavy on us since Sir Charles's death, but we'd be glad to stay on, if it would suit you, at least until you've had time to settle in." Sir Henry assured him warmly he had no thought of dismissing servants who had served his family so long and faithfully, and Barrymore's composed features relaxed very slightly into something like relief. The interior matched the exterior for age and gloom. A great high-beamed hall hung with ancient weapons, dimly lit by a fire that cast more shadow than light, a broad staircase rising into darkness at the far end. Mrs. Barrymore appeared to greet us, a large, impassive woman with something in her heavy features that struck me, even at first meeting, as concealing some private grief, her eyes reddened and heavy-lidded in a way I put down, at the time, to the natural gravity of a household still in mourning. We dined that evening in a long, oak-panelled room, family portraits looking down at us from the walls, dim and gilt-framed, stretching back through centuries of Baskervilles, their painted eyes seeming, in the candlelight, to follow our every movement with a kind of patient, ancestral disapproval. Barrymore moved about the table with quiet, practiced efficiency, though I found myself watching him rather more closely than good manners strictly allowed, turning over in my mind everything Holmes had said of his uncertain alibi. Sir Henry remarked more than once that he intended, once he'd settled his affairs, to have the whole house properly lit with electric light and be done with candles and shadows altogether. "It's a fine old house, Doctor," Sir Henry said to Mortimer, glancing up at the row of ancestral faces above. "Us. But I'll confess it's not quite what I pictured, growing up on stories of English country houses. I always imagined something a good deal cheerier. It was a cheerier house once, before the family fortunes declined somewhat," Mortimer said. "Your uncle did a great deal to restore it, though I think he never quite shook off a certain melancholy about the place himself toward the end." Something in this exchange seemed to settle over the table like a small chill, and I noticed Barrymore clearing a dish at that moment, pause for the briefest instant before continuing about his work. After dinner, Sir Henry proposed a stroll through the portrait gallery, and though the hour was late, curiosity got the better of both of us. We walked its length by lamplight, coming at last to a portrait considerably older and darker than most of its neighbours. A gentleman in the black velvet and lace collar of the Cavalier period, with a proud, handsome, faintly cruel face. A small brass plate beneath read simply, "Hugo Baskerville, 1647. Sir Henry studied it for a long moment. "So that's the fellow who started all this trouble," he said finally, with an attempt at lightness that didn't quite mask the unease beneath it. "He looks respectable enough hanging there in his lace collar. Hard to credit him with hellhounds and murdered farm girls looking at him now. A great many respectable-looking gentlemen have done a great deal of harm." "In their time, Sir Henry," I said, though I found, studying the painted face myself, that there was indeed something in the set of the mouth. And the cold, pale eyes I did not much care for, curse or no curse. We retired not long afterward, each to our own room, along a wide, upstairs corridor. Despite the exhaustion of a long day's travel, sleep did not come easily. The wind had risen, moaning fitfully around the old towers, and the house itself seemed to creak and settle around me with 100 small, unfamiliar sounds. I had been lying awake perhaps an hour when I heard quite distinctly over the wind the low, unmistakable sound of a woman weeping, a sound of deep, suppressed grief coming from somewhere elsewhere in the house. I lay still and listened for a long while, but the sound did not repeat itself, and eventually I fell into an uneasy sleep. I asked at breakfast whether Sir Henry or Mortimer had heard anything of the sort. Sir Henry admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he had heard it too, and had lain awake wondering whether he'd imagined it. When I raised the question with Barrymore himself, the butler's composed face grew, for just a moment, entirely still, and he answered, after the smallest of pauses, that there were only 2 women in the house, his wife and a young scullery maid, and he could think of no reason either should have been crying, unless perhaps the maid had been troubled by a bad dream. I did not entirely believe him, and said as much to Sir Henry once Barrymore had left the room. Mrs. Barrymore's eyes at breakfast were red and swollen in a manner no bad dream could easily explain, and there had been something in Barrymore's own hesitation that struck me as considerably more significant than simple, honest ignorance. I resolved to write Holmes a full account of it, sensing already, on only my second morning at Baskerville Hall, that the household concealed a good deal more than its master had yet been permitted to see. Chapter 5. The Stapletons of Merripit House. The morning after our first unsettled night dawned bright and almost cheerful, the wind having dropped, a pale autumn sun doing its best to soften the bleak lines of the moor. The moor by daylight, I discovered, was a rather different creature from the moor by dusk, still wild and unwelcoming in its way, but touched now with a kind of stark, honest beauty, the heather catching the light in shades of purple and gold. Sir Henry, restored by daylight and a good breakfast, proposed we walk out and get our first proper daylight look at the country that had loomed so darkly over our arrival. We had gone perhaps a mile when we came upon a small, wiry man of about 40, dressed in an old straw hat and flannel suit, hurrying toward us with a green butterfly net held aloft, occasionally darting sideways in pursuit of some fluttering quarry before recalling himself and resuming his direct approach. "Mr. Baskerville, I'll be bound," he called, while still some distance off, slowing to a more decorous walk, slightly out of breath. "You'll forgive the informality of introducing myself out here rather than calling properly, but I felt I couldn't delay making your acquaintance a moment longer. News travels fast across country this empty, Sir Henry. Faster than you might expect. I am Stapleton, of Merripit House, your nearest neighbour of any consequence." "Mortimer mentioned you," Sir Henry said, shaking his hand. "You're a naturalist, I understand." "An amateur one, though a devoted one," Stapleton said, his sharp, alert face creasing into an eager smile that showed a great many small, even teeth. He turned his quick, dark eyes toward me, studying my face with an attention that felt, even in that first moment, rather more thorough than simple neighbourly curiosity required. "And you must be Dr. Watson. Mortimer wrote to me himself mentioning you were coming down to keep Sir Henry company, a wise precaution given the unfortunate circumstances of Sir Charles's death." There was something in Stapleton's manner, an eagerness that verged, at moments, on the excessive, a way of watching us both rather more closely than casual conversation required, that I found myself noting with the same wary attention Holmes had urged upon me before we left London. He led us to where the heather gave way to patches of vivid green moss. "That is the great Grimpen Mire. Step into that in the wrong place, gentlemen, and there is no power on earth that will pull you out again. I've seen a moor pony wander into it and vanish within minutes. I know the safe paths myself, but I'd not advise either of you to attempt it without a guide who knows the ground as well as I do." As if to illustrate his point, a sudden, long, low cry rose from somewhere out across the mire, beginning as a deep, moaning note, and rising gradually into something closer to a distant, mournful howl, before fading into the ordinary silence of the moor. Sir Henry went pale, and I confess my own hand moved involuntarily toward my revolver. "Good God, what was that?" "The peasants say it's the hound of the Baskervilles calling for its prey," Stapleton said, with a small smile that didn't entirely reach his eyes. "I've heard it once or twice myself. The local explanation is that it's the bog settling, a sort of mud sighing as it shifts. Others favour a species of bird, the bittern, whose call is notoriously strange and carries a great distance. I incline toward the bird myself on the whole, though I'll admit the sound we just heard struck me as considerably larger and more mournful than any bittern I've personally encountered." We continued on, Stapleton pointing out birds and plants along our way with genuine and evidently sincere enthusiasm. A stonechat perched on a gorse bush, a particular variety of moor grass he considered underappreciated by botanists generally, the distant flight of what he assured us was a rare species of falcon. "I've made something of a study of this whole district these past 2 years," he told us. ever since giving up a rather less congenial line of work. The moor is a naturalist's paradise, gentlemen, whatever else it may be to those less inclined toward its particular charms. Until we came in sight of a small, comfortable farmhouse in a sheltered hollow, Merripit House itself. We had gone only a little further, however, when a young woman came hurrying toward us from the garden, moving with a haste that struck me as considerably more urgent than simple eagerness to meet new neighbors would explain. She came directly up to us, ignoring her brother's presence entirely, and addressed herself to me with an urgency that took me by surprise. "Go back," she said, low and quick, her dark eyes fixed on mine. "Go straight back to London, instantly. Ask me no questions, only go, and never set foot on the moor again while there is evil hanging over this place." "But I've only just arrived, madam," Sir Henry began, evidently believing, as I did for a confused moment, that her warning was directed at him. The young woman's expression changed at once, a flush rising to her cheeks. "You must be Sir Henry Baskerville," she said, in a voice now entirely different, composed, apologetic, embarrassed. "Forgive me, I mistook this gentleman for you in the poor light. I meant no particular harm by what I said, only, Sir Henry, I would say very nearly the same to you, and mean it just as sincerely. Go back to London, and don't come to Baskerville Hall again if you can possibly help it." "I'm afraid that's a good deal easier said than done, Miss Stapleton," her brother said, arriving somewhat breathlessly behind her, and giving her a sharp, questioning look. "My sister, Sir Henry. Beryl, this is Sir Henry Baskerville and Dr. Watson." "I know," Beryl Stapleton said, recovering her composure with visible effort. "I'm sorry, Sir Henry. I spoke foolishly and out of turn, and I hope you'll forgive a woman's nervous fancies about an old family legend she's heard entirely too much of since coming to live in this country. Please, won't you both come in and let me make amends with some tea?" We spent the better part of an hour at Merripit House, Stapleton showing off his considerable collection of pinned butterflies and pressed moor plants with genuine, undiminished pride, while his sister remained noticeably quieter, watching Sir Henry with an expression I found difficult to read, something combining genuine warmth with a persistent, unresolved anxiety. "You'll find the neighborhood a good deal smaller than you're perhaps used to, Sir Henry," Stapleton said over tea. "Beyond ourselves, there's Mortimer, whom you know, and old Frankland up at Laughter Hall, a litigious old fellow who spends his fortunes suing his neighbors over rights of way, and Mrs. Laura. Lyons in the village, Frankland's own daughter, estranged from him these several years. A sad case I won't dwell on today. Beyond that, you'll find precious little society this far out." I found a moment to speak with Beryl privately. "You spoke very earnestly a little while ago. Was there some particular reason for your warning, beyond the general unease the legend inspires in everyone hereabouts?" She hesitated, glancing toward her brother, before answering in a voice pitched low. "I spoke hastily, Dr. Watson, and I've already explained myself to Sir Henry as best I can. I would ask you not to make too much of it. My brother is devoted to this country and would be most put out to think I'd frightened his new neighbor away." "That's a considerably more measured answer than the one you gave us on the path," I observed. A faint flush colored her cheeks, and for a moment I thought she might say something more, but her brother's voice called across the room, asking her opinion on some point about an orchid, and whatever she'd been on the verge of confiding was lost, at least for that day. As we walked back toward the hall that afternoon, Sir Henry fell unusually quiet, and when he finally spoke, it was to remark, with a lightness that didn't entirely mask his interest, that he had rarely met so striking a young woman as Miss Stapleton, warning notwithstanding. "A rum sort of welcome, all the same," Sir Henry said after a while, kicking at a loose stone. "First a cry out of the mire fit to curdle a man's blood, and then a young lady mistaking me for you and telling me to flee the country before we've even shaken hands properly. You noticed, I suppose, that she corrected herself readily enough once she understood her mistake, but that the substance of her warning didn't actually change," I said. "She told me the same thing again, in effect, when I pressed her privately, only rather more carefully worded, as though she'd had a moment to consider how much she dared say." "You think there's something in it? Something beyond nerves and old superstition?" "I think a young woman does not generally run half the length of her garden path, out of breath and pale as a sheet, merely to repeat a piece of local folklore to a stranger she's never met. I said nothing to discourage Sir Henry's evident interest, though Holmes's earlier caution weighed on my mind. There was something evasive in Beryl's half-answer that did not satisfy me, and I resolved to mention the whole episode to Holmes, sensing that the Stapletons, brother and sister both, knew a good deal more than either was presently willing to share. Chapter 6. Secrets Under One Roof. I fell into the habit, in the days that followed, of writing to Holmes each evening with as full an account as I could manage of the day's events, trusting him to sift the useful grain from whatever chaff my own limited powers of deduction left mixed in with it. I reproduce here a portion of one such letter, written some 4 days after our arrival, since it captures rather better than memory alone the state of things at that point. Baskerville Hall, October the 15th. My dear Holmes, Sir Henry has called twice more at Merripit House, in hopes, I am reasonably certain, of encountering Miss Stapleton rather than her brother, though he has said nothing of this directly. Barrymore continues about his duties with the same composed efficiency, and I have observed nothing further to confirm or dispel my suspicions of him, save one curious detail. 2 nights ago, unable to sleep, I rose to fetch a book and saw a light moving beneath a doorway some distance ahead of me, Barrymore's own room, unless I mistake the house's geography. Sir Henry remains in good spirits, though I believe the weight of his situation is beginning to settle on him more heavily than he lets show. I await your further instructions, and remain your friend, J. Watson. 2 nights later, I understood the light fully. Unable to sleep again, I heard the soft, careful tread of someone moving along the corridor outside my door, moving with the particular, deliberate quiet of someone anxious not to be heard. I rose and followed, using what moonlight came through the tall windows to guide my steps rather than risk a light of my own. The figure ahead, tall, moving with an economy of motion I recognized as Barrymore's own, turned into an empty room near the end of the west wing, its furniture shrouded in dust sheets. I crept close enough to see him clearly by the light of a single candle he'd set upon the windowsill. He stood at the window, holding the candle close against the glass, moving it slowly back and forth in a manner too deliberate to be accidental, the unmistakable motion of a man signaling to someone watching from the darkness beyond. I watched for perhaps a full minute before deciding I could not, in good conscience, simply return to bed. I stepped into the doorway. "Barrymore," I said, "what is the meaning of this?" He spun about, his composed face stripped entirely of its usual neutrality, showing a naked alarm I hadn't believed him capable of. "I beg you, sir, say nothing to Sir Henry, not yet, not until I've had the chance to explain properly, and even then I ask it only for someone who has done no one any harm beyond what desperation has forced upon him." He glanced toward the window, then back at me. "It concerns my wife's brother, Sir Selden." The name struck me at once with its full significance. The escaped convict? The Notting Hill murderer? "The same, sir, God help us both," Barrymore said, tears starting in his eyes. "My wife's own brother, sir, whatever wickedness he's fallen into since. He was a wild boy always, spoiled, I think, by our late master's own father, and it broke my wife's heart to see what he became, but he is her brother still, sir, the only family she has left, and blood is blood, whatever a man has done. When he escaped and made his way onto the moor, half-starved and with nowhere else to turn, he came to us in secret, tapping at the kitchen window one night, begging for food and silence. Could you have refused your own sister in her place?" "And the candle?" "A signal, sir, exactly as you supposed. We leave food for him at a certain spot on the moor, near an old shepherd's hut, and the candle tells him when it's safe to come collect it, and when the search parties are too close. And he must stay hidden another night. It's a wicked, dangerous business, and I've told my wife 100 times it will be the ruin of us both if discovered, but she will not hear of turning her own brother over to be hanged." Before we parted, Barrymore asked whether he might fetch his wife, so I might hear the fuller truth from her own lips. Mrs. Barrymore came to us wrapped in a shawl, her eyes red and swollen with a grief that plainly went back considerably further than that single night's. Discovery, her hands trembling faintly as she settled herself into a chair, plainly uncertain what fate my knowledge might bring upon her and her husband. "He was my mother's favourite, sir, being the youngest, and she indulged him past all sense, and my father, being a hard man himself, drove him further into wildness, trying to beat it out of him," she said, twisting the shawl's fringe. I've not seen him in a dozen years, and I confess I hardly knew the man who came tapping at our window, so changed was he. But he wept, sir, actual tears, begging only for bread and a night's shelter, and I could no more turn him away than my own child. What would you have done in my place? I told her honestly I did not know, which seemed to comfort her more than any firm judgment would have. I promised I would say nothing to the authorities, provided Sir Henry's own safety wasn't thereby endangered. I laid the whole matter before Sir Henry the following morning, and Barrymore, true to his word, confirmed the account himself and begged the young baronets. Discretion, which Sir Henry, to his considerable credit, granted readily, expressing more sympathy for Mrs. Barrymore's plight than condemnation for the deception. But where I had expected the matter to end quietly there, Sir Henry surprised me with a rather more energetic response. A dangerous man loose on my own land, within a mile of this house and fed by my own servants, he said, pacing the breakfast room. I don't care what sympathy I feel for her position, Watson. I can't simply sit by knowing such a man wanders free so close to where I sleep. I mean to go out tonight and see if we can't catch sight of him ourselves and turn him over to the authorities before he does some fresh harm to an innocent soul. I argued against this course as strongly as I reasonably could, mindful of Holmes's insistence that Sir Henry never venture onto the moor after dark for any reason whatsoever. You gave Holmes your word, Sir Henry, not to walk the moor alone after dark, and I don't believe a manhunt for an escaped murderer was quite what either of us had in mind as an exception to that promise. I shan't be alone, Doctor. You'll come with me, surely, armed as we both are, Sir Henry said, with a particular stubborn set to his jaw I had come to recognize. Besides, I gave my word not to go wandering the moor for pleasure's sake, not that I'd sit idle in my own house while a murderer camps within sight of my windows. In the end, I judged it wiser to accompany him myself than let him go alone, or argue the point indefinitely while whatever chance we had slipped away with full darkness. We set out that night an hour after Barrymore's signal was due, following at a discreet distance toward a lonely standing stone marked as the spot where food was left. The night was clear and cold, a nearly full moon casting the moor in pale, silvery light that made the ground ahead of us visible enough to walk by, though every gorse bush and boulder took on, in that uncertain light, a shape rather more sinister than daylight would have granted it. We had gone perhaps 3/4 of a mile, picking our way carefully around patches of ground that gleamed with a suspicious, boggy sheen, when we saw a ragged figure rise from behind a boulder and break into a run across the open moor, moving with the desperate haste of a hunted animal that has heard the hounds before it has properly seen them. "There he is," Sir Henry cried, and set off after him at once, myself close behind, though Selden, who knew the moor's dangers and had spent weeks learning its hollows purely, to survive, proved considerably faster and more sure-footed than either of us, and within a few minutes had vanished entirely among the rocks of a distant tor. It was as we stood there, gathering our breath, that I chanced to look up toward a jagged tor some distance to our right, and saw, standing motionless against the pale disk of the moon, the black, silent silhouette of a man, utterly still, watching us with the same fixed attention we had a moment before given to Selden's flight. The figure stood with an upright, composed bearing entirely unlike Selden's scrambling desperation. I caught Sir Henry's arm and pointed, and he saw it too, and for a long, strange moment neither of us moved, until, as silently as it had appeared, it was gone. "Who in God's name was that?" Sir Henry whispered at last, his earlier bravado considerably subdued. "I don't know," I said, and found my voice was not entirely steady. "But I mean to find out, if it takes me every night between now and Holmes's arrival to do it." Chapter 7. The Light on the Moor. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm, the ordinary business of country life proceeding alongside a current of unspoken tension none of us quite knew how to address directly. The weather turned changeable, bright mornings giving way to sudden squalls that swept in off the moor with little warning, and I found myself watching the shifting sky each day with an attentiveness that had less to do with any real interest in meteorology than with a growing, half-superstitious sense that the moor itself was somehow keeping its own private counsel about what it had witnessed and what it yet intended. I kept my nightly letters to Holmes faithfully, though a certain frustration crept into my accounts as the days passed without further sighting of the mysterious figure on the tour, and without any reply from Holmes beyond brief, businesslike acknowledgements telling me his own inquiries in London remained incomplete. Sir Henry, meanwhile, continued his visits to Merripit House with an eagerness that grew harder to disguise with each passing day, finding some fresh pretext most mornings to walk in that direction. I found myself cast, whether I wished it or not, in the role of reluctant chaperone to a courtship I'd been given no clear instruction either to encourage or prevent. Miss Stapleton, for her part, seemed to return his interest with a warmth that sat oddly alongside the urgent warning she'd given at their first meeting, as though two entirely separate impulses, genuine affection and some deeper, unexplained anxiety, waged a continuous, silent war within her. It was on one of these visits, some 10 days after our arrival, that matters came to a head. I had accompanied Sir Henry part way toward Merripit House that afternoon, intending to call on Mortimer in the village, and spent a pleasant enough hour with him discussing, among other things, his own continuing researches into the local prehistoric remains scattered about the moor, touching only briefly on whether he had heard further word from Holmes regarding the estate's legal history. Mortimer confessed he had written twice to his solicitor without yet a satisfactory answer, the tracing of so old and scattered a family tree proving slower business than either of us had hoped. I was returning some hours later along the same path when I came upon a scene that stopped me short. Sir Henry and Miss Stapleton stood together in a small clearing, Sir Henry holding both her hands, speaking with an earnestness that required no closer hearing to interpret. Before I could decide whether to advance or withdraw, Stapleton himself came running across the moor at a pace that spoke of considerable agitation, his face contorted with an anger entirely unlike his usual manner. "Let go of my sister this instant," he cried, his voice carrying clearly across the still air. Sir Henry released her hands at once, more from startled surprise than any sense of wrongdoing. "Stapleton, I meant no," Sir Henry began, but Stapleton cut him off. "You think because you're a baronet you can trifle with a woman's affections as you please. I've seen how you look at her, and I'll not have it. Not while she's under my protection, and not from a man we know so little about beyond a name and a fortune." "I've done nothing dishonourable, and I'll thank you to believe it," Sir Henry said, recovering something of his own temper. "I've told your sister plainly that I've grown fond of her, which any man with decency might do without inviting this kind of scene." The quarrel continued for some minutes, Stapleton's fury seeming, to my ear, considerably out of proportion to whatever offence Sir Henry had actually given, until Miss Stapleton herself intervened, and it ended with Stapleton offering a stiff, clearly reluctant apology, explaining his own excessive protectiveness toward the only family he had left. I made my presence known only after the Stapletons had withdrawn, and found Sir Henry considerably shaken, though more puzzled than genuinely offended. "I don't understand the man," he said, as we walked back. "One moment friendly as you like, and the next flying at me like I'd insulted his sister's honour, when all I'd done was tell her plainly I'd grown fond of her. Did Miss Stapleton herself seem distressed by your declaration before her brother arrived?" I asked. Sir Henry considered this seriously. "No. If anything, Doctor, I'd have said she seemed glad of it, right up until the moment her brother came charging across the moor like a bull at a gate. There was something in her manner before that, though, that I couldn't quite place, as though she wanted to say more than she allowed herself to." Stapleton called at the hall himself 2 days later, apologizing more fully, his manner restored entirely to its usual eager warmth. He explained at some length that he and his sister, having lost both parents young, and having only each other to rely on through a difficult early life, had grown, perhaps unnaturally close, and that he found himself quite against his own better judgment, unable to view any suitor for her hand with anything like a rational eye. "I would ask only this, Sir Henry," he said, with an earnestness that seemed on this occasion entirely genuine, "that you give my sister and myself a little more time to grow accustomed to the idea before matters progress any further between you. A few months, no more." Sir Henry agreed to this request with evident relief at the quarrel's peaceful resolution, though I noted, in writing my account to Holmes that evening, my own private suspicion that Stapleton's request served some purpose considerably more calculated than simple brotherly sentiment. A man does not generally recover so completely and so quickly from a fit of genuine, uncontrollable jealousy. It was some few nights after this reconciliation that a fresh development returned my attention forcefully to the mystery of the silent watcher on the Tor. We had received a visit that afternoon from old Mr. Frankland of Laughter Hall, a querulous, red-faced gentleman of advancing years who arrived uninvited and stayed considerably longer than his welcome, occupying the better part of an hour. With complaints about a right-of-way dispute and boasts about the telescope he kept mounted on his roof, from which vantage point, he assured us with evident pride, very little happening on the moor for miles around escaped his notice. I saw the search parties out again just yesterday, hunting that wretched convict, Franklin told us, warming to his favourite subject. Fools, the lot of them, blundering about in broad daylight when any man with sense knows a hunted creature moves by night. I've caught the local school board out in their negligence twice this year already, through that very telescope, watched their surveyor mismark a boundary from my own rooftop clear as day, and had the whole business before a magistrate within the fortnight. But I saw something a good deal more interesting than soldiers with rifles, if you care to hear it. A boy, sir, a boy of perhaps 14, making his way toward the old stone huts. On the moor with a bundle over his shoulder, moving with a purpose that told me plainly he wasn't merely rambling for pleasure. Twice now I've seen him make the same journey, always toward the same spot. I've half a mind to report it to the police myself, though I don't suppose they'd thank me for the trouble. This news struck me forcibly, and I pressed Frankland for further details, the boy's route, the time of day, though the old man, delighted to have found so attentive an audience, proved rather more interested in extending his own account with fresh boasts about his telescope's triumphs than in answering my questions with any useful precision, wandering off into an entirely unrelated grievance about a neighbour's hedge before I could steer him back to the matter at hand. Once he had finally gone, well satisfied with an afternoon's audience for grievances his own household had plainly grown weary of hearing, I sat down to consider what I had learned. A boy carrying supplies to the stone huts fit poorly with what I knew of Selden, who had shown himself entirely capable of fending for himself once fed by the Barrymores, moving swiftly and independently with the desperate self-sufficiency of a hunted man. It fit instead with a theory that had been slowly forming in my mind since the night of our failed pursuit, that the silent watcher on the Tor was no phantom, but a man living rough on the moor by deliberate choice, someone with resources and a purpose of his own, someone who required food brought to him by an accomplice too young and unremarkable to draw suspicion from the soldiers still combing the district. I resolved that very night to seek out those old stone huts myself and settle one way or another the question of who or what had been watching us so calmly from the darkness. Chapter 8. The Man on the Tor. The stone huts, when I finally reached them after nearly 2 hours of careful roundabout walking designed to keep me hidden from view for as much of the approach as the open moor allowed, proved to be the scattered remains of some ancient settlement, low circular walls of unmortared stone, roofless and half-collapsed, that Perkins had pointed out to us on our very first drive from the station without either of us suspecting what significance they might come to hold. There were perhaps 20 of them scattered across a shallow depression in the moor, half hidden among the heather, each a silent relic of some vanished people who had once made their homes on this same bleak ground, long before ever a Baskerville set foot upon it. I made my way among them with considerable caution, my revolver drawn, examining each in turn, and finding nothing beyond the ordinary emptiness of long abandoned ruin, until I came to one set somewhat apart and rather better preserved than its neighbours, its low doorway partially shielded from view by a fold in the ground. Someone had made this hut habitable, in a rough and evidently temporary fashion. A blanket lay folded in one corner, along with the remains of a small fire carefully banked to minimize its smoke, a few tin cans neatly stacked, and, propped against the wall, a slate on which someone had chalked a rough note in a small, careful hand, Dr. W.'s movements, cum Tracy tues. I stood staring at this for a long moment, a cold unease settling over me that had nothing to do with the evening chill already creeping across the moor. Someone had been tracking my own movements and recording them in a hut equipped for a stay of some duration rather than a single night's rough camping, a loaf of bread wrapped carefully in cloth, a second blanket rolled and set aside, a small store of candles. I searched further, my hands not quite steady with the strange mixture of fear and fascination the discovery had provoked. Finding a well-worn newspaper folded open to London news rather than anything local, and, tucked beneath the blanket, a small notebook containing further jottings in the same careful hand. Our visit to Merripit. House noted and dated. The confrontation on the moor recorded with a brevity that gave no hint how the observer had come to witness it. Even our nightly habits at the hall sketched with an attention to detail that left me feeling, for the first time since our arrival, genuinely and thoroughly watched in every particular of my daily life. One entry read, L.L. Coombe Tracy, denies letter. I turned the initials over in my mind, and it took only a moment's reflection to arrive at a name mentioned to us more than once since our arrival. Laura Lyons, Franklin's estranged daughter. I made my way that same afternoon into the village of Coombe Tracy to call upon her. I found her at her lodgings above a small shop, a striking dark-haired woman whose beauty was somewhat marred by a hardness about the eyes that spoke, I thought, of disappointments not easily borne. She received me with evident wariness once I'd introduced myself, and explained my visit concerned matters touching on Sir Charles Baskerville. I've nothing to say about Sir Charles that I haven't already said to whoever sent that other gentleman round asking the same questions not 3 days past, she said, her chin lifting defensively. This admission startled me considerably. Another gentleman, Mrs. Lyons? Might I ask what he wished to know? She studied me for a long moment, before answering with evident reluctance. He asked whether I had written to Sir Charles asking him to meet me at his gate the night he died, and I told him the truth, as I'll tell you now, since it seems the whole business is determined to be dragged into the light one way or another. I did write to him, asking for money. A private matter, concerning my own unhappy marriage and the cost of freeing myself from it through the courts. Sir, Charles had once offered to help me with exactly such an expense, being a generous man and sympathetic to my situation. But I did not keep the appointment, sir, whatever anyone may suspect of me. I was persuaded, at the last moment, that I could obtain the help I needed by other means, and stayed home that night and learned of his death only the following morning, same as everyone else in the district. Persuaded by whom, if I may ask? She hesitated. By a friend, sir, who assured me the matter would be handled without my needing to trouble Sir Charles directly, and who I have since come to wonder whether I ought to have trusted quite so readily. I'll say no more than that, Dr. Watson. I did not press her further, but left Coombe Tracy with a growing conviction that the friend she declined to name might well prove to be Stapleton himself, given his evident familiarity with her situation. I returned to the stone huts that same evening, resolved to keep watch, reasoning that a man who kept so detailed and current a record must surely return before very much longer. I settled myself among the rocks as the light began to fail, and waited through the gathering darkness. I had been waiting perhaps 2 hours, the moor grown fully dark and a thin, cold mist rising from the lower ground, when I heard quite distinctly the sound of careful footsteps approaching from the direction of the tor above. I raised my revolver and pressed myself back against the stone wall, watching a tall, dark shape resolve itself gradually out of the mist. "It's a lovely evening, Watson," said a voice I knew as well as my own, dry and faintly amused. "I really think you'll be more comfortable out here on this rock than in that draughty little hut, though I confess it's served me tolerably well these past several days." "Holmes!" I cried, so startled I very nearly dropped my revolver entirely. "Good heavens, man, how long have you been out here?" "Nearly a week now," Holmes said, settling onto a rock with the easy comfort of a man perfectly at home in his surroundings, despite several days' evident roughing it showing in his unshaven face and travel-worn clothes. "And I'm sorry for the deception, Watson. Genuinely sorry, though I promise you it was necessary. I judged that my quarry, whoever that ultimately proves to be, would grow considerably more cautious the moment he learned Sherlock Holmes had arrived openly to take charge of the investigation, whereas a man he believed safely occupied in London might be watched rather less carefully. I have spent this week watching this entire district with my own eyes rather than trusting to your reports, alone. And they have been excellent reports, Watson, better than you perhaps credit yourself for. Cartwright has been bringing your supplies then, the very boy Franklin spotted?" "The very same. I brought him down from London myself, the day after you and Sir Henry departed, and he has served me admirably as both provisioner and messenger. And the notebook, tracking my own movements, and Mrs. Lyon's. My own methods, Watson, applied to this case exactly as I would apply them to any other. I have watched you, Sir Henry, the Stapletons, Barrymore, Frankland, and Mrs. Lyons. Besides, because I did not yet know which of you held the key to this business, and a detective, who assumes his answer before gathering his evidence, very often arrives at the wrong one. Then tell me now, Holmes, in whatever order you please. Holmes was quiet a moment, studying the dark line of the moor. I believe the man we seek is closer to us, and has been from the very beginning, than either of us initially supposed. I believe the legend of the Hound has been deliberately cultivated and exploited by someone with a very particular and very old motive. You mean Stapleton, I said, the realization arriving with the force of something I'd half suspected for days. Holmes did not answer directly, which I had come to know was very often his way of confirming a suspicion he was not yet prepared to state outright. I have not yet gathered proof sufficient to hang a man, Watson, and until I have, I will not name him even to you. You must say nothing of my presence here to anyone, not even Sir Henry, until I judge the moment right. I was on the point of pressing him further, when a sound reached us both across the dark moor that drove every other consideration from my mind. A long, terrible, agonized scream, rising and breaking and rising again, carrying clearly through the still night air from somewhere out toward the heart of the moor. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. Good God, Watson, that came from the direction of the mire. Come, quickly. Chapter 9. Death on the Moor. We ran together across the dark moor, guided only by the memory of the sound's direction and Holmes's own knowledge of the ground, gained through his week of hidden observation, threading a path between patches of ground he indicated with brief, breathless warnings I trusted absolutely despite having no time to verify them myself. My lungs burned with the cold night air and the unaccustomed pace, and more than once I stumbled on unseen ground, catching myself only by Holmes's own steadying hand at my elbow. We came at last to the edge of a steep rocky slope descending toward the fringes of Grimpen Mire itself, and there, in the pale moonlight, we found what we had feared, though not, as it turned out, in quite the form either of us had expected. A man's body lay sprawled at the foot of the rocks, having evidently fallen some considerable distance, his neck bent at an angle that told me, even before I knelt to confirm it. With a physician's practiced eye, that death had come instantly upon impact, sparing him at least any prolonged suffering from the fall itself, whatever terror had driven him to it. His clothes were ragged and filthy, his hair and beard matted, his hands scored and bleeding from what looked to be days of rough living on the open moor, and I recognized him at once, even in death, as the same wild figure Sir Henry and I had glimpsed fleeing across the moor on the night of our earlier pursuit. Selden, I said quietly. Holmes knelt beside me, examining the body with the same close, methodical attention he brought to every scene of this kind. He fell running, Watson, in blind panic from the marks on the rock face above, running from something that terrified him badly enough to make him careless of his own footing on ground he otherwise knew well enough to navigate safely. That scream we heard was not the sound of a man falling. I've heard men cry out in a fall before, and it has a different character. That was the sound of a man terrified before ever he lost his footing. Terrified of what? Holmes continued his examination, and his expression changed. Watson, look at these clothes, ragged, filthy, clearly slept rough in for days. But look at the cut of them, the quality beneath the dirt. These were never a convict's own clothes issued from Princetown prison. These are considerably finer than that. I looked more closely and saw at once what he meant. Sir Henry's cast-off clothing, I said, the realization arriving with a cold, sick certainty. The Barrymores must have given Selden some of Sir Henry's old things to replace his prison garb. Precisely, Watson. And there, I think, lies the whole tragedy of tonight's business. Holmes rose slowly, staring out toward the mire. Someone set a hound on this man's trail tonight, Watson, believing him to be Sir Henry Baskerville, dressed in Sir Henry's own clothes, carrying Sir Henry's own scent. Whoever engineered Sir Charles's death, and whoever has been plotting Sir Henry's since, they made their move tonight, and by the purest chance in the world, it was the wrong man who paid the price. I felt a chill pass through me. Then the Hound is real. Real enough to have killed a man, Watson, whatever its ultimate nature proves to be. Whether it walks by supernatural power or by very earthly design, I cannot yet tell you with complete certainty, though I have my own strong suspicions on the point, and they run considerably closer to earthly design than to anything the old manuscript would have us believe. We were interrupted by the sound of footsteps hurrying toward us, Stapleton himself, a lantern in hand, his face arranged in an expression of concerned alarm I found myself unable to fully credit as genuine. "I heard a scream," Stapleton said, somewhat breathlessly, drawing up short at the sight of the body, and then, a moment later, at the sight of Holmes, whom he plainly hadn't expected to find here. "Good heavens! Mr. Holmes, is it? I had no idea you had arrived in the district." "I arrived only today, and mean to return to London again tomorrow, my business here being nearly concluded," Holmes said smoothly, with a fluency that startled me. "Watson wired me some concerning details, and I judged it worth a brief visit before returning to more pressing matters in town. It seems my visit has coincided with a rather grim discovery." "Is it?" Stapleton hesitated, peering down at the body with what struck me as a rather too careful scrutiny. "Surely that's not Sir Henry?" "No," Holmes said, watching Stapleton's face with an attention I recognized as considerably sharper than his easy tone suggested. "This is the escaped convict, Selden, wearing what appears to be some cast-off clothing of Sir Henry's own. A case of mistaken identity in the darkness, I should think. A tragic accident, and nothing more sinister than that." I watched Stapleton's face carefully as Holmes spoke these deliberately misleading words, and though I could not have sworn to it before a jury, I fancied I saw something flicker briefly behind his eyes. Relief, perhaps, or something closer to the particular satisfaction of a man hearing his own careful theory confirmed by an unexpected authority, before his features rearranged themselves into an expression of shocked sympathy, so smoothly and quickly that had I not been watching for exactly such a transition, I might easily have missed it altogether. "A terrible business all the same," Stapleton said, shaking his head slowly. "The poor wretch. I suppose we must send word to the authorities and to the Barrymores, given the family connection which I understand is now common knowledge in the district, Dr. Watson having been kind enough to keep me informed of the household's difficulties." This last remark, delivered with what seemed a pointed emphasis, reminded me uncomfortably that I had indeed mentioned Selden's identity to Stapleton at some earlier point in our acquaintance. "I shall see to it myself," Holmes said. "You need trouble yourself no further tonight, Mr. Stapleton." Stapleton took his leave shortly after. Once he'd gone, Holmes turned to me. "You noticed his reaction, I trust?" I thought he seemed almost relieved once he understood it was Selden and not Sir Henry lying there. "Exactly so, Watson, and a man is not generally relieved to learn that his neighbour's tragic death is merely a case of mistaken identity, unless the correct identity was one that mattered a very great deal to him personally. I have suspected Stapleton from very nearly the first day of my own observations here, though I have lacked, until tonight, anything approaching sufficient proof to act upon that suspicion. Tonight's tragedy has given me a good deal more to work with than I possessed even this morning." "Then you do believe it's Stapleton behind all of this?" Holmes was silent a long moment, staring down at Selden's still form. "I believe we shall know a great deal more within the next few days than either of us presently does, and that Sir Henry's continued safety depends very heavily on our moving carefully and quietly until I have gathered proof enough to act with complete certainty. A premature accusation now would achieve nothing beyond warning him to cover whatever traces of his scheme remain uncovered." We walked back toward the hall together, as far as the point where our paths diverged, Holmes returning to his hidden camp and I continuing on alone. I found Sir Henry still awake, and listened as he questioned me closely about the manner of Selden's death, sensing, I think, that there was more to the story than I was presently willing to share. "You were gone a long while for an evening walk, Watson," he said, watching me with a directness I found difficult to meet entirely honestly. "And you came back looking as though you'd seen something considerably worse than a man's dead body. Is there something you're not telling me?" "There is a great deal happening that I'm not yet at liberty to share, Sir Henry, and I'm sorry for it," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I promise you it's for your own protection, and I promise the wait won't be a long one now." Sir Henry studied me a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not quite satisfaction, but a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke well of his own good sense. "You've never steered me wrong yet, Doctor. I'll trust you a while longer." "A tragic end for the poor devil, whatever his crimes," he added, staring into the fire. "I confess I feel some measure of relief, God forgive me for it, knowing he's no longer wandering loose on my own land." A brief inquest was held 2 days later in the village, and the coroner, with little patience for lingering over the death of an escaped convict, returned a verdict of misadventure without much investigative rigor. Old Frankland attended the proceedings with evident relish, cornering me afterward to declare he'd half suspected the fellow would come to exactly such an end, having watched the search party's incompetent efforts through his telescope for the better part of a fortnight. I listened with as much patience as I could muster, grateful at least that his account contained nothing to suggest he'd seen anything of Holmes's presence on the moor. I wrote to Holmes that same evening, setting down a fuller account of Sir Henry's reaction and closing with a question that had troubled me since our parting on the moor: whether Stapleton might attempt some fresh and more direct move against Sir Henry now that his first attempt, however accidentally, had claimed the wrong victim. The reply, when it came, was brief but firm: "Watch Sir Henry closely. Do not let him walk alone under any circumstances. I believe our friend's patience is nearly exhausted, and a desperate man moves faster and less carefully than a patient one." Chapter 10. The Portrait and the Trap. Holmes returned to Baskerville Hall openly 3 days after Selden's death, arriving by the ordinary afternoon train and driving up to the front door in broad daylight, a piece of theatre intended to suggest to anyone watching from Merripit House that he had only just concluded whatever business had detained him in London. Sir Henry's delight at his arrival was considerable and entirely unfeigned. "I'd begun to think you meant to leave the whole business entirely in Watson's hands," he said, shaking Holmes's hand warmly. "I came the moment I judged my presence here would do more good than harm," Holmes said, which was, I reflected, very nearly the literal truth. "And I understand there is a good deal to discuss, some of it rather more painful than I would wish to bring to a man so recently welcomed to his own inheritance. Might I trouble you for a look at your family's portrait gallery? Watson's account of it has interested me considerably." We climbed together to the long gallery, Holmes moving along the row of ancestral faces with close, methodical attention, until we came at last to the dark, Cavalier-era portrait of Hugo Baskerville. Holmes studied it for a considerably longer time than any of the others, and finally asked Sir Henry to hold a lamp at a particular angle while he himself covered the broad-plumed hat in the portrait with his own hand, obscuring it from view. "Now, Watson," he said, "come and look at this, and tell me what you see." I came and looked, and felt a genuine start of recognition. With the hat concealed, the face beneath it, the dark, curling hair, the narrow, watchful eyes, the thin, cruel mouth, bore a resemblance to a face I had come to know rather well over the preceding weeks. "Stapleton," I said, scarcely believing my own eyes. "Precisely, Watson. The family likeness is unmistakable once the anachronistic details of costume are set aside." Holmes turned to Sir Henry, whose face had gone pale. "Sir Henry, I believe I can now tell you with some confidence that your neighbour is in fact a Baskerville himself, the son, unless I am very much mistaken, of your Uncle Roger, who did not, as the family believed, die childless in Central America, but rather left behind a son who has spent the better part of 2 years living quietly in the shadow of an inheritance he believes should rightfully be his own." Sir Henry sank into a chair, staring at the portrait as though seeing it for the first time. "Then it's been him all along, the letter, the boots, poor Selden's death, all of it, engineered by my own cousin for the sake of an inheritance he had no legal claim to whatsoever." "Precisely so. He arrived in this district some 2 years ago under an assumed name, having previously run a school in the north of England that failed under circumstances I have made some inquiries into, and found rather less creditable than he has represented an outbreak of illness among his pupils that some of the surviving parents attributed to considerably worse than simple bad luck. He came south, changed his name, and settled at Merripit House with the woman he presented to this district as his sister. He ingratiated himself with Sir Charles, learned the family's genuine, deep-seated fear of the old legend, and recognized in that fear a weapon he, could use to remove both Sir Charles and eventually yourself, without ever needing to risk the far greater danger of an ordinary, traceable crime. And the woman I've called his sister, Beryl? Holmes's expression grew grave. That, Sir Henry, is a matter I mean to settle definitively before this affair concludes, and I would ask you to prepare yourself for news that may prove considerably more painful than anything I have yet told you tonight. Sir Henry sat quietly for a long moment, turning his glass in his hands. I keep thinking of him at his own table, laughing over his butterflies, all the while knowing exactly what he intended for me. I don't know that I've ever felt more of a fool in my life, Mr. Holmes, than I do tonight, thinking how readily I took him for a friend. You are not the first man of good character to be deceived by a clever one, Sir Henry, and I don't doubt you won't be the last. Stapleton is, by every account I've gathered, a man of genuine intelligence, and no small charm when he chooses to exercise it, qualities that make a considerably more dangerous villain than the sort who announces his malice plainly. There is no shame in having been taken in by him. The shame, such as it is, belongs entirely to him. We travelled together to Coombe Tracey the following morning to call once more upon Mrs. Laura Lyons. Holmes conducted the interview with a gentleness I had not always seen him extend to reluctant witnesses, drawing out, over the course of nearly an hour, a fuller and considerably more damning account than she had given me alone. Mrs. Lyons, Holmes said, once the preliminaries were settled, I must ask you something rather delicate. Do you know a Mr. Stapleton of Merripit House to be a married man? The colour drained visibly from her face. Married? No, he told me he was unmarried, that the woman at Merripit House was his sister, nothing more. I am sorry to tell you that she is in fact his wife, and has been for some years, Holmes said, with a gentleness that did nothing to soften the evident force of the blow. I believe he used the pretense of their sibling relationship for two purposes. First, to allow her greater freedom to encourage Sir Henry Baskerville's affections without any appearance of impropriety, furthering some scheme regarding the inheritance, and second, to allow himself the same freedom in encouraging your own affections, and thereby securing your cooperation, in a plan that required Sir Charles Baskerville to be lured, alone and unprotected, to a lonely gate on the night he died. Mrs. Lyons wept then, bitterly, and when she had recovered herself sufficiently to speak, she confirmed everything Holmes had suspected, that Stapleton had encouraged her to write to Sir Charles requesting the meeting, under the pretense that he himself would help her secure the money she needed by other means, and had then persuaded her, at the very last moment, to break the appointment, ensuring that Sir Charles would wait alone at the gate precisely as required. He told me it was for my own protection, that a woman meeting a strange gentleman alone at night would invite gossip, she said, her voice raw with a betrayal that seemed to encompass a good deal more than the immediate facts of Sir Charles's death. I see now, it was nothing of the kind. Holmes obtained from her, before we departed, a full written statement of everything she had told us. I left Coombe Tracey that afternoon with the uncomfortable but unmistakable sense that we now possessed sufficient understanding of Stapleton's scheme to move decisively against him, provided we could catch him and whatever creature he had trained to do his killing in the very act of attempting Sir Henry's life, since Holmes remained adamant that circumstantial evidence alone would not suffice to convict so careful and clever a man in a court of law. We must draw him out, Watson, Holmes said, as we drove back toward the hall in the gathering dusk. He believes his scheme still concealed, and Sir Henry still ignorant of the danger surrounding him. We must use that false confidence against him. He had already wired Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, asking him to come down within the next 2 or 3 days. As for drawing Stapleton out, Sir Henry had a standing invitation to dine at Merripit House whenever he cared to accept it. I propose he accept that invitation for 2 evenings hence, and walk home afterward across the moor by the direct path, as he has done on several previous occasions, alone and apparently unguarded, while you and I, and Lestrade besides, lie concealed among the rocks along that same path, ready to intervene the moment Stapleton makes whatever move he intends. I confess the plan alarmed me considerably. You mean to use Sir Henry himself as bait, knowing what we know of the creature that killed Selden? I mean to use him as bait under conditions of the closest possible protection, Watson, rather than allow him to continue walking that same path in genuine ignorance of the danger. I take no pleasure in the necessity of it, but I see no other way to bring this matter to a definite and provable conclusion. We told Sir Henry the full truth that evening, and I watched the news land upon him with a visible, physical weight. "Married?" he repeated, staring into the fire. "The whole time I believed myself falling in love with her. She was another man's wife, playing a part her own husband had assigned her. We cannot yet know how much of her own conduct was willing, and how much coerced by a husband she may have feared as much as obeyed," Holmes said gently. "I have seen nothing in her behavior toward you that struck me as entirely calculated deception, and a good deal that suggested genuine and considerable distress at the role she found herself required to play." Sir Henry agreed, after some further discussion, to the plan. "I'll do it," he said finally. "Though I'll admit the thought of sitting at that man's table again turns my stomach considerably more than any hound on the moor manages to do. Promise me only that you'll be close enough to reach me in time." "You have my word, Sir Henry," Holmes said gravely, "and I do not give it lightly." Holmes also made 2 further visits alone to the edge of Grimpen Mire in the days that followed, returning with his boots caked in mud and a look of grim satisfaction. "I believe I know now where he keeps the creature," he told me. An old outbuilding on a small island of firm ground near the heart of the mire, accessible only by a path marked with stakes. I heard from a safe distance sounds that satisfied me entirely as to what we shall find there. And the ghostly appearance the legend describes? Phosphorus, Watson, applied to the muzzle and eyes of an ordinary, if unusually large, dog. I suspected as much from the very first description Mortimer gave us. A hound bred large, kept half-starved to sharpen its ferocity, and painted with a substance that glows unearthly in the dark. Such a creature, released upon a man already terrified by a lifetime's exposure to his family's darkest legend, would require no genuine supernatural power at all to produce the effect we witnessed in poor Selden's death, nor, I fear, in Sir Charles's before him. Lestrade arrived from London 2 days later, a small, sharp-featured man whose brisk manner I had encountered on several previous occasions alongside Holmes. "A phosphorescent dog, Mr. Holmes?" he said, once Holmes had explained the theory, in a tone mixing genuine incredulity with the reluctant respect he'd learned to extend even to Holmes's more outlandish-sounding conclusions. "I've seen a good many strange things in this business, but I'll admit that's a new one, even for you." "Stranger things have hanged men before now, Lestrade, and this one will hang a man too before we're finished with him, provided we manage the next 2 days with proper care," Holmes said. His evident skepticism regarding the whole business of hounds and curses gave way, once Holmes had laid out the full case, to a grudging and increasingly serious attention. Word came the same evening that Stapleton had renewed his invitation for Sir Henry to dine at Merripit House 2 nights hence, and the final arrangements for our trap were set in motion. Chapter 11. The Hound. A peculiarity in the air troubled Holmes almost from the moment we set out to take up our positions along the moor path Sir Henry would use for his walk home. We had spent the better part of that day in careful preparation, Holmes walking the path himself twice more in daylight to fix every rock and hollow in memory, Lestrade cleaning and reloading his revolver with the brisk efficiency of a man who took no chances with faulty equipment, and myself checking my own weapon with a nervous thoroughness that betrayed rather more of my private apprehension than I cared to show. "A fog is rising, Watson, and rising faster than I would like," Holmes said, studying the low white mist creeping up from the direction of the mire. "If it thickens, as I fear it may, we shall have the devil's own time seeing anything at all, and a hound that hunts by scent has no need of clear sight, fog or no fog." We took up our position among a scattered group of granite boulders, perhaps 200 yards from Merripit House, with Lestrade a short distance further along, all 3 of us armed and watching the lit windows of the Stapleton residence. Through those windows, at intervals, we could see the small domestic tableau of the dinner in progress. Stapleton's animated gestures as he talked, no doubt entertaining. His guest with some fresh anecdote about moths or orchids, entirely unaware that the foundations of his careful scheme were, at that moment, crumbling around him unseen. The cold deepened steadily as we waited, seeping up through the rock we crouched behind, and I found my mind returning, again and again, to Selden's terrible death cry on. This same moor only days before, and to the phosphorescent horror Holmes had promised us we would soon face with our own eyes rather than merely hear described second-hand. The fog thickened steadily as the evening wore on, rolling up from the mire in slow, deliberate waves until it lay across the lower moor like a sea, the black tors rising above it like islands. If that fog reaches the path before Sir Henry starts his walk, we may lose sight of him within 20 yards of stepping out that door, Holmes murmured, his own composure showing its first genuine strain since the case began. At last, some time after 10 o'clock, the door of Merripit House opened, spilling lamplight briefly across the garden path, and Sir Henry's figure emerged, calling some final pleasantry back over his shoulder, before setting off along the path at a brisk, unhurried pace. He passed quite close to our hiding place, near enough that I could see his breath clouding in the cold air, and continued on into the thickening fog beyond, his figure growing indistinct and finally vanishing entirely. We waited, tense and silent, for what felt an agonizingly long interval, straining our ears for any sound beyond the ordinary night noises of the moor, until, quite suddenly, a low, terrible growl rose out of the fog ahead of us, followed almost instantly by the sound of Sir Henry's own voice crying out in genuine alarm. Holmes was on his feet in an instant, revolver drawn, running toward the sound with a speed I struggled to match, Lestrade close behind us both. And then, bursting suddenly out of the fog directly into our path, we saw it. I have faced a good many dangers in my years of military and medical service, and I do not use the word lightly when I say that the creature which came bounding toward us through that drifting white mist was, for one genuinely terrible instant, the most frightening thing I have ever laid eyes upon. It was a hound, unmistakably, but a hound grown to a size I would have declared impossible had I not seen it with my own eyes. Its coat black as the darkness itself, and its muzzle and the deep, sockets of its eyes glowing with a ghastly, unearthly blue-green fire that seemed, in that moment, to owe nothing whatsoever to the rational chemical explanation Holmes had given me only days before. It came on in great silent bounds, making straight for the fleeing figure of Sir Henry, who had turned to face it with his own revolver raised but seemingly frozen for one fatal instant by simple terror at the sight bearing down upon him. "Fire, Watson, for God's sake, fire!" We fired together, our shots ringing out across the misty moor in a ragged volley, and I saw the great creature stumble, recover, and come on again with a fresh, agonized howl that seemed to shake the very fog around us, before a second volley brought it down at last, not 10 feet from where Sir Henry stood, its huge body convulsing once and then lying still. Sir Henry had fainted dead away by the time we reached him, but I found, to my profound relief, nothing beyond the ordinary marks of a bad fright and a fall. The creature had not managed to close its jaws upon him before our shots brought it down. Holmes knelt beside the fallen hound, examining it with the same close attention he brought to every other piece of evidence, and called us over once he had satisfied himself of its true nature. "Come and see, Watson, and let this settle any lingering doubt either of us might still have harbored about the supernatural nature of this creature." He ran his hand along its muzzle and showed us the phosphorescent substance coming away on his own fingertips. A cross of mastiff and bloodhound, I should think, chosen precisely for size and the bloodhound's keen scenting ability, made monstrous to the eye by artifice and driven to a killing. Fury by weeks of deliberate starvation. A cruel business from beginning to end, and I confess I feel considerably more pity for this poor animal than I do for the man who made it. Lestrade, who had approached to examine the creature alongside us, let out a low whistle, shaking his head slowly. "I've seen a good many strange sights in this business, Mr. Holmes, but I never expected to shoot a monster on Dartmoor when I boarded that train this morning." "The newspapers may print whatever satisfies public appetite for sensation," Holmes said, rising and wiping his hand on his handkerchief, "provided the official record shows the truth clearly enough for any future court proceeding. For now, our more pressing concern is Stapleton himself." Then came the urgent question, where was Stapleton? "He'll have heard the shots and known at once that his scheme has failed," Holmes said. "We must reach Merripit House before he has the chance to destroy whatever evidence remains there, or to make good his own escape. Lestrade, stay with Sir Henry. Watson, come with me." We hurried back through the thinning fog toward Merripit House, finding the front door standing open and the house dark and apparently deserted, until a muffled sound from an upper room drew us hurrying up the stairs, where we found Beryl Stapleton bound to a chair with cords cut cruelly tight into her wrists, a gag fastened over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror and a relief so thoroughly mixed together that I scarcely knew which emotion moved me more. We freed her at once, and she collapsed into genuine, shuddering sobs the moment the gag was removed, though she recovered herself with a speed that spoke of considerable inner resolve. "He knew you suspected him," she said, once she could speak clearly. "He came home in a fury this afternoon, raving that his whole scheme had unravelled, and when I told him I would go to Sir Henry myself and warn him of everything, he struck me and bound me here, saying he meant to flee the country tonight, whatever became of his plans for Sir Henry or for me." "Which way did he go?" Holmes asked urgently. "Toward the mire. There's an old tin mine on a small island of firm ground near its very heart, where he kept the Hound hidden. He showed me the path once, marked with stakes, though I never dared use it myself. He said he meant to hide there until the search for him had died down, and then make his way to the coast by night. We set out within minutes, guided as best we could manage by Beryl's own hurried, uncertain directions, the fog still thick enough across the lower ground to make every step a matter of genuine hazard. I have rarely undertaken a more frightening journey than that desperate pursuit across Grimpen Mire in the darkness, each footstep tested with the greatest caution before I trusted my full weight to it, conscious every moment of the soft, sucking ground that lay in wait on every side for the smallest misstep. We called Stapleton's name repeatedly into the fog, our voices swallowed almost immediately by the thick, muffling white silence, receiving no answer beyond the occasional startled cry of some night bird and the mire's own strange, wet, sucking sounds as unseen currents shifted somewhere beneath its deceptively solid-looking surface. We found eventually some considerable distance out into the mire's heart, a single boot, black with the mire's own dark mud, standing upright and half sunk at the edge of a particularly treacherous stretch of ground where the marked stakes seemed to diverge in two directions, as though the fleeing man had, in his panic, mistaken his path at precisely this crucial juncture. Holmes examined it with a grave, quiet certainty. He tried the crossing in the darkness and fog, rather than wait for a safer hour, and the mire has claimed him for its own, Holmes said quietly, turning the muddy boot over in his hands. Whether by his own miscalculation of a path he thought he knew well enough to trust even under these conditions, or by some final desperate panic that sent him astray, we shall likely never know for certain. The Grimpen Mire has swallowed a good many creatures over its long history, and tonight, I think, it has claimed considerably the worst of the two-legged sort to venture across it in living memory. We searched the immediate area as thoroughly as the treacherous ground and persistent fog allowed, calling out once more into the enveloping whiteness in case some faint chance remained that Stapleton yet lived, but found no further trace of him beyond that single mud-blackened boot, and Holmes judged it far too dangerous to continue the search deeper into the mire's heart until proper daylight and considerably more experienced local guidance could be arranged. "There is nothing more we can safely do here tonight, Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to encompass a good deal more than the physical exhaustion of the night's events. "Whatever judgment history makes of Jack Stapleton, the mire has rendered its own verdict tonight, more final and more complete than any court of law could have managed." We made our way back, at last, exhausted and thoroughly chilled through to the bone, the fog beginning at last to thin as the night wore toward its final hours, revealing once more the familiar dark shapes of the tors standing sentinel against a sky now beginning to show the first faint promise of approaching dawn. Neither of us spoke a great deal during that long walk, each occupied with our own private reckoning of everything the past weeks had cost. Selden's desperate, terrified death, sir. Charles's own earlier end, engineered with such patient, calculating cruelty, and now Stapleton's final drowning descent into the very ground he had used so ruthlessly to further his ambitions. We found Sir Henry at the hall, recovered enough to sit up and take a little brandy, his colour returning slowly, though his hands, I noticed, still trembled faintly as he raised the glass to his lips, and he listened to our account of the night's final events with an expression I found difficult to read. Relief at his own deliverance mixed unmistakably with a lingering grief for the strange and terrible fate of a man who had, whatever his crimes, once seemed to Sir Henry very nearly a friend. "And Beryl?" he asked quietly, once we had finished. "She is presently at Merripit House under Lestrade's protection, considerably shaken but otherwise unharmed beyond some bruising her husband inflicted before he fled," Holmes said. "What becomes of her beyond tonight, Sir Henry, is a question I think only time and her own choices can properly answer. I would counsel you against any hasty judgment either way until she has had the chance to recover from tonight's ordeal." Sir Henry nodded slowly, staring into the fire with an expression that suggested his own feelings on the matter remained, for the present, every bit as unresolved as the fate of the woman who had inspired them. Chapter 12. What the Moor Kept. It was some weeks later, back in the familiar comfort of our own sitting room at Baker Street, the fire burning cheerfully against a cold London evening and the moor's damp, heather-scented air replaced by the more ordinary smells of tobacco and coal smoke, that Holmes finally consented to lay before me the complete and orderly account of the whole affair, tying together threads that had, throughout our time in Devonshire, remained tangled and incomplete. Stapleton learned of his true Baskerville ancestry from papers left by his father Roger, after that unhappy man's death in Costa Rica, Holmes said, settling into his chair with his pipe. He first attempted a school in Yorkshire, which collapsed under circumstances I've traced to considerable cruelty toward the boys in his care, cruelty that led eventually to at least one child's death. He changed his name, gathered up his wife under the fiction of a sisterly relationship, and made his way to Devonshire, where Sir Charles, elderly, wealthy, and without other close family beyond a distant nephew in America, presented an opportunity he could not resist. And the Hound? Purchased from a dealer in London, and kept hidden at that old tin working on the Myers Island of solid ground, visited only rarely and always after dark. When the moment came, he lured Sir Charles to that lonely gate, using poor Mrs. Lyons as his unwitting instrument, and released the Hound upon him in the darkness. Sir Charles's heart, already weakened by the very fear Stapleton had spent months cultivating, gave out before the creature ever closed the distance between them, which is why the body showed no wound of any kind. And Sir Henry's boots? An attempt to secure some article carrying his scent, so the Hound might be given his trail to follow rather than requiring Stapleton's own physical proximity at the crucial moment. His first attempt, the new boot, failed him. Never worn, it carried no useful scent, and he was forced to risk a second theft of an old, thoroughly worn boot. That very error, the exchange of a new boot for an old one, first suggested to me the true and rather sinister purpose behind what might otherwise have passed for simple hotel pilferage. And the black-bearded man in the cab, watching us in London before ever we came down to Devonshire. Stapleton himself, having followed Sir Henry from the moment his ship first landed, anxious to judge for himself what manner of man he would need to deal with, and growing sufficiently alarmed by my own involvement to attempt frightening Sir Henry away from Devonshire entirely before matters progressed any further. I asked, at last, the question that had troubled me since the very final moments on the moor. "Do you believe Stapleton is truly dead, Holmes? We found no body, only a boot." Holmes was quiet a long moment, staring into our fire. "I believe it exceedingly likely, Watson, given everything we know of that ground and the desperation of his flight through it. But I will confess to you, and to no one else, that I have never been entirely comfortable leaving a case without a body to confirm its ending, and I suspect that discomfort will linger with me a good while yet. The Grimpen Mire keeps its secrets very thoroughly, Watson, as thoroughly, perhaps, as this whole strange and troubled family has always kept its own." "And Beryl? What has become of her?" "She has returned to South America, Watson, to relatives of her own family there, having declined Sir Henry's rather generous offer of continued support, feeling, I believe, that the whole unhappy business had left her too closely associated with tragedy in this country. I corresponded with her briefly, before her departure, and satisfied myself that her own conduct throughout this affair was very largely coerced rather than willing. Her urgent words to Sir Henry on the very day of our arrival represented her own conscience fighting, as best it could, against a husband's controlling and often violent will. Sir Henry has taken the news of her departure hard, I think. He has, though I believe time and the considerable distraction of settling properly into his new inheritance will serve him better than any words of comfort either of us could presently offer. Dr. Mortimer tells me he has arranged to accompany Sir Henry on a lengthy tour abroad, before Sir Henry finally settles into Baskerville Hall as its permanent master. Sir Henry called on us the evening before his ship sailed, considerably more like the cheerful young man who had first shaken Holmes's hand in this very room than the shaken, grieving figure we had last spoken with in Devonshire. "I mean to see something of the world before I settle down to being a proper English baronet, Mr. Holmes," he told us. "Egypt, I think, and perhaps further east besides. Mortimer tells me there are ruins in the desert that would put even Baskerville Hall's age to shame, and I find myself rather looking forward to standing among stones considerably older than any family curse, English or otherwise." "A sensible enough ambition," Holmes said, "and I don't doubt you'll return a rather steadier man for the experience. I've thought a good deal these past weeks about what you told me regarding Beryl's own part in this business, that her conduct was coerced rather than willing, whatever appearances suggested at the time. I wrote to her in the end before her own ship sailed, telling her I bore her no ill will, and wishing her well in whatever life she builds for herself now. I don't know that I'll ever entirely understand my own feelings about the whole affair, gentlemen, but I found I couldn't let her sail without at least that much said between us." "A generous gesture, and I think a wise one," Holmes said quietly. "Bitterness serves no one well in the long run, Sir Henry, least of all the man who carries it." Sir Henry did indeed depart on his tour some weeks later, and wrote to us both regularly throughout his travels, his letters growing steadily more cheerful as the months passed, and returned the following spring to take up his proper place at Baskerville Hall at last, determined, he wrote to me, to be remembered as a rather better neighbour to the district than certain of his ancestors had managed to be. He had commissioned electric lighting installed throughout the house, and the old, unused west wing, where I had first discovered Barrymore's candle signal finally, renovated, as though by filling the house with light he meant, quite deliberately, to drive out whatever lingering shadows the old legend had left behind in its ancient stones. As for the legend itself, I confess I have never fully decided in the years since precisely what to make of it. Holmes, characteristically, insists the entire episode proves nothing beyond what patient, ruthless human cunning can accomplish when it borrows the trappings of the supernatural to disguise a purely earthly and purely selfish purpose. "Strip away the phosphorus and the old manuscript's frightening prose," he said to me once, "and you are left with nothing more mysterious than an ambitious man, a hungry dog, and a great deal of very ordinary human greed. I have found, across the whole of my career, that this explanation serves rather better than any appeal to the supernatural, however much less satisfying it may prove to the imagination that craves a proper ghost story." And he is, I have no doubt, entirely correct in the particulars of this case, exactly as thoroughly as his reasoning proved correct in every previous mystery I have had the privilege of recording during our long association. Science and cold observation carried the day in Devonshire, precisely as they had carried the day in every other investigation I had watched Holmes conduct, and I would be doing my friend's remarkable gifts a genuine disservice to suggest otherwise merely for the sake of a more romantic conclusion. And yet, I find myself, on quiet evenings when the wind rattles our own London windows in a manner not entirely unlike that first restless night at Baskerville Hall, thinking sometimes of that old manuscript Dr. Mortimer read to us in this very room, and of poor Hugo Baskerville riding out into the darkness 200 years before, chasing a terrified girl across ground not so very different from the ground that would, centuries later, claim his own distant and considerably more calculating descendant. I think, too, of Selden's terrible scream in the darkness, and of the great creature's dying, guttering glow as the last of its unnatural fire faded from eyes that had, in life, known nothing but cruelty and the crude purposes to which a wicked man had bent them. And I wonder, on those quiet evenings, whether some curses, once set loose upon a family and a stretch of lonely ancient moorland, ever entirely finish working themselves out, or whether they simply wait, patient as the mire itself, for the next foolish, ambitious soul willing to put on the old legend's borrowed and terrible clothes, and walk once more into that same dark and waiting country. Baskerville Hall stands still, I am told, its towers grey against the Devonshire sky, its yew alley walked now by a master who has, by every account, brought considerably more light into its ancient rooms than darkness, and I like to think that whatever the moor truly is or is not, it has at least been persuaded, for the present, to keep its darker secrets to itself a while longer. The end. You've just experienced The Hound of the Baskervilles, carefully condensed and rewritten into modern English while remaining faithful to Arthur Conan Doyle's unforgettable mystery. If you enjoyed this adaptation, subscribe for more timeless classics retold in clear, modern language, making the world's greatest books easier to enjoy without losing what made them unforgettable. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next classic adventure.